In our previous lesson, we created our models, course, enrollment, and student. Now what we need to do is create a DB context to allow these classes to actually reference a table or DB set and be initialized by our Razor pages to have access to the data that we're going to store in the SQL Server database. So let's go ahead and add folder, data. And in our data folder, let's start with a school context class. In our school context class, let's go ahead and add our inheritance from the DB context. And let's go ahead and add our course, enrollment, and student data sets, entity sets. And again, these are going to be objects that we're going to create later in the Razor pages so we can have access to the actual data in the SQL Server database relative to the entity framework classes that were provided. Let's go ahead and quick actions. And then also add our models. Okay. Go ahead and pause, type out all the code, and we'll get started in a minute. And before we move on, just know that implicitly, Entity Framework will automatically create the enrollment and courses because student actually references those in the data models. But for the course, I would like for you to go ahead and add the courses and enrollments explicitly. Now, to create the actual tables, what I'd like for you to do is go ahead and add the following code using our onModelCreating event method, and have it go ahead and relate the course entity to, or entity set, to a table course in the SQL Server database. Do that for all three of our entity sets in the Entity Framework, and that will provide the initialization of those tables if they don't yet exist in SQL Server, or in our case, local DB. Next, what we have to do is actually register our dependency injection. This allows us to have access to these classes within our Razor pages as a service. So go ahead and open up startup.cs and scroll down to configure services, and we're going to add our service so that we can have access to it again in the Razor pages at a later date. By the way, what I'm doing is I'm right-clicking. Anytime I see an underscore, I right-click on it. And you'll see that they disappear once I right-click and go to our quick actions and add that library. And you'll see it added up here, for example. Okay. Now go ahead and pause here and type out the following code in your configure services in the startup.cs. Okay, what this is again doing is providing a service for our Razor pages. So in the constructor of those Razor pages, we can actually get the context, in this case school context. Also notice that we have a default connection for the connection string, which links it to the SQL Server database or local DB in our case, which means that's the next thing we need to create. So go ahead and go to app settings, and we'll set our connection string in app settings. I'm going to be using LocalDB. The benefit of LocalDB is it is a very thin client for SQL Server, provides it as a file, an MDB file on the file system. And we can go ahead and make sure you set your database to SP College 1, and we'll change that at a later date, but let me scroll over here just so you can see some more. Okay. Go ahead and pause it, type what you see for our connection string here, and I'll scroll over to the right, and you can type out the rest of the connection string. Go ahead and pause again. Again, that SQL Server Local DB is a very lightweight version of SQL Server. Makes it very easy for us to do debugging. It's not something you use in a live environment. We'll be later we'll be actually pushing this out to Microsoft Azure, and we'll have a different connection string on the Azure servers running to a true SQL Server. I'll show you how to do that at a later time as well. Okay, the final thing we need to do is go ahead and add a DB initializer. And what we want to do this for is to actually create data in the tables for our development purposes so that we can actually have users and courses and students accessible in the tables. So go ahead and go to your data folder, add another class, and let's call this class DB initializer. And we're going to add some code here to create the initial tables. There's quite a bit of data here, so you're going to want to pause this and type it out as you see it. The first thing I want to do is get rid of my underlying squigglies. So I can right-click Quick Actions and add our models. Make sure that all our errors are gone, and they are. Okay. Let me go ahead and open this up so you can see everything, and we'll do a page at a time. Go ahead and pause here. Type out all the code exactly as you see it. Okay, now go ahead and pause here and type out the course content exactly as you see it. Okay, and then we'll scroll down to get the enrollment data. So go ahead and type this out exactly as you see it. Okay, this is only going to create these records if there is no database. For example, here the context is checking to ensure that the database is created. If the database is already created, it will not create or add any values or records into or entities into those entity sets. And it will only do that if the database is not there. So commonly when we're doing testing here in our environment, learning environment, is we'll go and delete the database so that it will reinitialize the data in the database. I'll show you how to do that at a later time as well. Okay, that's it for this lesson.